Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about artificial neural networks. First, I just want to say that this lecture is a bit difficult, and I will talk about some of the nitty-gritty details of artificial neural networks. But the details are only there to help you understand the lecture on a more conceptual level. So the important thing is to understand it on a conceptual level. I won't test you on the more mathy aspects of it. Nevertheless, you should try to understand the details as well. Okay. So first, we'll review the differences between the information processing approach and the connectionist approach. Then we'll talk about brain imaging methodologies in the neuron, which makes sense because artificial neural networks are sort of born out of the knowledge that we got from brain imaging methodologies such as fMRI and single cell recording, which we'll talk about, of course. Then I'm going to talk about neural networks on sort of a conceptual level, and then we'll talk about some of the more nitty-gritty details, which will include a discussion of artificial neurons, single and multi-layer networks, logic gates, and then I'll provide some examples. And those examples are going to be kind of redundant with the examples that I provide on the conceptual level. Then we'll talk about characteristics and limitations of artificial neural networks, which are also very important. Okay, so to review, the computational theory of mind basically asserts that the mind is literally an information processing computer. Of course, this doesn't mean that we're made of silicon, but it's a computer as defined by a functionalist view. And in the beginning of cognitive science, they took the distinction between software and hardware pretty seriously. The dominant view was just as you could understand how a computer program worked without necessarily understanding how the hardware works. So just as you could understand how the software on a computer works without necessarily understanding how the hardware works, you could also understand how the mind works without understanding how the brain works. And as we've mentioned, many cognitive scientists believe that if we could figure out the rules of the mind, then we could implement those rules on any sort of suitable medium, such as a computer. All right. So the information processing approach was more dominant from the 1950s to the 1970s. I want to say it's still around. It's not gone. We still use it. It's just not as dominant as it used to be. In any case, this approach asserts that the mind is like a computer in the sense that our minds operate on a logic-based formal system, just like a computer. It also assumed that we represent information with symbolic representations that are representations are propositions, which are sentence-like but not necessarily sentences. It also made the assumption that processing is done in stages or serially, which means that one stage cannot begin until the previous stage has been completed. That's basically what serial means. It also assumed that there was at least, there was a fair amount of modularity in the mind. And as we know from our previous lecture on modularity, modularity involves independent and informationally encapsulated processes, components, or modules. And of course, this view endorses the view that the mind is multiply realizable, meaning that the rules of the mind can be instantiated on many different physical systems. Finally, I don't want to say I wrote that the brain is irrelevant to understanding the mind. That's not quite right. So I don't want to say that the brain is irrelevant to understanding the mind, but this view assumes that the mind could be understood without understanding the brain or without studying the brain. Okay, whereas in contrast, the connectionism approach is a more novel approach that came out in the 1980s. It actually came out in the 1950s, which we're going to talk about, but it got a big resurgence in the 80s. And this is about using the brain to constrain our theorizing about the mind or thinking about the mind. So, for example, uh, psychologists know that the brain is filled with neurons, and when a neuron receives enough information from a presynaptic neuron, it fires. And the other thing is that these neurons seem to be organized into neural networks that communicate with one another. So connectionism tries to model how the mind works by using nodes. And nodes are these little circles here, you can see. Uh, and these little circles are what we would call nodes, which represent neurons or collections of neurons. So connectionism tries to model how the mind works by using nodes that send activation to connected nodes. And each node will get activated by different things that are connected to a variety of different other nodes. And the interesting thing is you can model a lot of uh, things that are similar to how the mind works, or seems to work at least, right? So large language models are very, human-like in the way they talk, and they can they can mimic a lot of um, a lot of human behavior pretty similarly. And in this framework, knowledge and mental processes are represented not by symbols and rules, but by patterns of activation across a network of nodes. And for each connection between two nodes within a network, there is a weight. And when I say weight, I mean WEIGHT. So a weight. There is a weight for each connection. And that weight determines the rate at which information is sent. So how fast does a node send its activation to another node? This weight can be adjusted in a way that simulates a bit of learning. So if you learn something, your connection weight changes. It could increase or it could decrease depending on the model. Okay, so again, in the 1980s, scientists used a connectionist theoretical framework that emphasizes the role of interconnected networks or simple processing units or nodes, which again are meant to represent neurons or collections of neurons. So when you hear somebody talk about artificial neural networks or deep learning, this is what they're talking about. And so the idea is that the mind is constrained by the brain. And so we should use our knowledge about the brain to understand the mind. In other words, the knowledge about the brain should provide constraints that help us theorize about the mind. I would say that this allows us to model much more flexibility and adaptivity in our cognitive models and our models of cognition. And so, there might be cognitive scientists much smarter than me that would disagree, but I would counter that argument with I would cite the recent AI boom in generative AI as a counter to that argument. So the fact that large language models like ChatGPT and Claude can do what they do is because of neural networks. And this suggests that these models do a better job at modeling flexible, adaptive, and sophisticated behavior, something that symbolic models had, I would argue, some difficulty because, again, symbolic models are not the reason why we have the recent AI boom. Okay, this framework allows for different types of representations, right? So these types of neural network models, they can model propositions pretty well, propositional knowledge, which is symbolic, but which we know this because large language models are essentially using neural networks to represent propositions, but they tend to be much better at perceptual information, such as pictures. So that is discriminating and identifying objects in pictures. They're really good at that. So one thing that is at the core of connectionism is that processing can be done in a parallel and interactive fashion. So if we think about the picture naming example, if I want to say the word cat, if I see a picture of the word cat and I want to say the word cat, I can start retrieving the phonemes that are associated with the word prior to fully retrieving the concept or semantic units associated with the word cat. And one of the things that is interesting is that if both the phonemes and the semantics influence retrieval of the word, this actually leads to speech errors that are semantically and phonologically similar to each other. So we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but this explains why we're more likely to make speech errors that are related to the intended word semantically, but also share phonemes. So for example, if you're trying to say the word cat, you might be more likely to say rat instead of dog because rat is not only semantically similar to cat, but it also shares some of the phonemes with cat, more so than dog, right? So rat and dog are both semantically similar. So it would make sense why you would say rat or dog instead of cat. But the thing is that you're more likely to say rat instead of dog simply because it shares more phonemes with the intended word of cat than dog does. Okay. And this might seem intuitive, but the connectionist approach can predict this, whereas other models don't. So it's interactive because the two layers of processing are sort of interacting with each other as opposed to working in an informationally encapsulated fashion. I believe that this approach still endorses multiple realizability, right? Uh, though I can see why people would say it seems to more logically follow from the information processing approach. Okay. And finally, the connectionist approach embraces the study of the brain as it assumes that it will help constrain theories about the mind. However, in both approaches, I would say that the focus is more about how the mind works than about how the brain works, right? The importance of studying the brain is primarily important because it helps us understand the rules of the mind. Okay, so just to contrast these two, just to recap, the information processing approach says that cognition is computation or formal symbol manipulation on sentence-like structures using logical rules, right? So it essentially says that representations are symbolic, or in a loose sense, most of your thinking is based on language as units of manipulation. Um, what else did I want to say? Yeah. And this is in contrast to the connectionist approach, which says that cognition emerges from the interactions of simple processing units organized in networks. And then the information processing approach says that knowledge is represented symbolically, whereas the connectionist approach takes a step in denying that representations are symbolic, at least in this sense, and that instead processed uh, they're processed by a patterns of activity distributed across a network, right? So, and this processing is distributed and occurs in a parallel fashion, guided by statistical and associative principles. Um, okay. And then what else did I want to say? Is that yeah, okay. And so it also says, so the information processing approach, sorry, says that processing occurs in stages or serially, meaning that one stage has to be complete before the next stage begins. Whereas the connectionist approach says that the processing is done in parallel. So one stage can occur simultaneously while the other stage uh, begins, right? Okay, and so in the next video, we're going to talk about methods of brain imaging methodologies.